The wind screamed through the high ridges of the Rockies, a sound that carried with it the sharp bite of snow and the loneliness of winter. The trail that wound along the mountain's edge was treacherous even in daylight, but now, under a moon half hidden by clouds, it was a place where only desperation or madness would lead a soul. Along that path, barely visible against the drift of white, something small stirred, a bundle left to the mercy of the storm. At first there was only silence, then a faint cry, thin as a thread, trailing into the night. It was not the sound of strength, but of fading life. And then, carried almost as if the wind itself whispered it, a word formed, "Papa." Before we follow the fate of this child, and the man destined to hear that call, subscribe to our channel for more powerful frontier stories where survival and redemption rise out of the harshest lands. Down the slope, not far from the trail, a man stirred from his camp. Jedediah Carter, known simply as Jed, sat with his back to a pine, firelight flickering across a face worn like old leather. His beard was flecked with gray, and his eyes, deep, restless, belonged to a man who had seen more loss than comfort. He was a trapper, a mountain man by necessity and choice, living far from the towns that mocked and pitied him in equal measure. The fever that had taken his wife and daughter years ago had left him hollow, and in that hollow space he had built a fortress of silence. He had long ago sworn never to bind his heart to another living soul. The mountains, cruel as they were, had at least been honest. They demanded work, vigilance, respect, and in return they gave solitude, food, and a place to lay his head. To Jed, that was enough. Yet on this night something disturbed the rhythm he had come to trust. At first he thought the cry belonged to a coyote pup caught in the cold, but coyotes never spoke words. He froze, listening again, the hair on his arms prickling beneath his wool shirt. The sound came faintly, then stopped, swallowed by the storm. His instincts told him to ignore it. Whatever fool had lost their way on the trail had sealed their own fate, and Jed owed nothing to anyone. Still he found himself rising, grabbing his rifle more from habit than intent, and trudging uphill toward the sound. Snow crunched beneath his boots, heavy and wet, dragging at him like chains. He cursed softly under his breath. Damn fool's errand. But his feet did not stop. The trail was narrow, edged by a drop that fell into darkness. He squinted against the blowing flakes and saw the shape, small, still. Kneeling, he pulled back the ragged cloth. His breath caught. It was not a bundle of supplies, not a lost dog. A baby lay there, cheeks pale, lips trembling blue, tiny fingers clawing weakly at the air. Jed felt the bottom drop out of his chest. He staggered back, shaking his head. No, I ain't taking this on, not again." His voice cracked against the wind. Memories struck with the force of a hammer, his little girl coughing, fading, his helpless hands unable to save her. He had buried that pain deep, but now it rose raw and sharp. The baby whimpered, a sound so fragile it might have been lost if not for the sudden silence of the wind, as though the mountain itself held its breath. Jed stared. Then, as before, that faint murmur, "Papa." He closed his eyes. "Lord help me," he muttered. His rough hands scooped the bundle up, pressing it against his chest. The child was colder than the stones around them. He pulled off his buffalo hide coat, wrapping the infant inside, and without looking back at the trail, turned down toward his cabin. He walked fast, driven by something he refused to name. Each step felt heavier, not from the snow, but from the weight of what he carried. Not just a child, but the crack of fate breaking through the walls he had built. Jed had lived alone for years. Tonight, that life was over. The cabin sat low in a hollow, logs darkened by years of storms, smoke curling faint from the chimney. Jed pushed the door with his shoulder, snow scattering off his boots as he carried the bundle inside. The air was warmer here, though not by much, the fire in the hearth little more than embers. He set the rifle aside and lowered the baby onto a bearskin rug, crouching near the glow. The child whimpered weakly, eyes closed, skin pale as the moon outside. Jed stared down, his chest tight with something he didn't want to name. What fool leaves a babe out in the storm? His voice was low, rough with disbelief. He rubbed his temples, pacing a step, then crouched again. The fire needed stoking. He grabbed a split log, dropped it on the coals and blew until sparks leapt and flames licked higher. Heat filled the small space, bringing life back to the room. He pulled the baby closer to the warmth, tugging the hide tighter around its body. For a moment he just watched. Every sound seemed louder than it was. The snap of the wood, the hiss of melting snow on his coat, the shallow, strained breaths of the child. He should not have picked it up. He knew that already. It wasn't his problem. The mountains had their own ways, their own justice, but still the memory of that faint word, Papa, clung to his ears. He rubbed his beard hard, muttering, "I ain't no father to nobody." The baby stirred, let out a cry, thin but sharper now. Jed flinched, heart twisting against his will. The cry rattled the walls of his chest, dragging him back years he had buried. His daughter, little Mary, lying fevered under quilts, calling for him as her strength faded. He had failed then. The memory was a scar that no amount of solitude could cover. He knelt again, his hands trembling as he touched the child's cheek. Cold. Too cold. "Easy now," he whispered, surprising himself with the softness in his voice. "We'll get you warm." But warmth was not enough. The babe needed food. He had no milk here, nothing fit for one so small. He cursed under his breath, scanning the shelves. Dried venison, beans, a flask of whiskey. None of it would do. In the corner, the old nanny goat shifted, bleating softly at the disturbance. Jed's eyes settled on her. "Well, old girl," he muttered, "looks like you might just save a life tonight." The goat did not resist as he worked, though the process was clumsy. Jed poured what he could into a tin cup, then dipped a rag into the warm milk, pressing it gently to the baby's lips. At first, nothing. Then, slowly, the child sucked weakly, clinging to life with each small swallow. Relief washed through Jed, though he did not admit it aloud. He sat back on his heels, exhaling long. "Lord help me, what am I doing?" he asked the empty room. The fire popped, the goat chewed, and the baby's tiny hands moved against the blanket as if reaching for something unseen. Outside, the storm beat harder against the shutters. Jed listened, every instinct in him screaming that he should not be tied to this fragile burden. Out here, survival meant keeping to your own skin. Taking on another's struggle was a quick path to the grave. And yet, when he looked down at the child so small against the wide world, he felt something he thought had long ago died. He ran a hand over his face, muttering, "If you make it through this night, little one, then maybe we'll see." The words hung in the air, a vow he hadn't intended to make. The baby stirred again, softer now, as though in answer. Jed felt the weight of the storm outside, the loneliness of the cabin, and the unfamiliar spark that had just been lit inside him. He sat by the fire through the long hours, rifle within reach, the baby resting on his chest. When dawn finally touched the ridges, Jed's world had already begun to change. The night dragged on with the patience of a predator. Jed sat by the fire, arms cradling the bundle against his chest, every muscle tense. The baby's breaths were shallow, uneven, each one sounding as though it might be the last. He had weathered storms, hunger, and the bite of wolves, but nothing had ever made him feel this helpless. The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind. Jed laid another log on the fire, coaxing it to burn bright, feeding the fragile warmth that stood between life and death. He shifted the baby, pulling the hide tighter, trying to keep the cold from creeping in. He muttered, "You're tougher than you look, little one. You got to be, or you won't see morning." He set the tin cup by the hearth to keep the goat's milk warm. Each time the child whimpered, he dipped the rag again, pressing it gently to the lips that trembled like petals in frost. The sucking was weak, halting, but it was there. Every swallow felt like a victory. His thoughts, however, were not merciful. They clawed at him, dragging him backward. He saw Mary again, his little girl, her hair damp with sweat, eyes glazed with fever. He had sat just like this then, begging her to hold on, whispering promises he couldn't keep. The fever had taken her anyway, and with her had gone the best part of him. Now here he was, another small life in his arms, Another chance for the mountains to remind him how powerless a man truly was. He clenched his jaw, shaking his head. "This ain't my fight. I should have left you there." But even as he said it, he pulled the baby closer, pressing his rough cheek to the soft bundle. Hours passed. Jed dozed in fits, jerking awake each time the child stirred. The firelight painted the walls in restless shadows, as though ghosts from his past had come to sit beside him. He rocked the baby gently, something his hands remembered, though his mind fought it. At one point, the baby let out a thin cry that cut deeper than silence. Jed whispered, "Hush now, I got you." The sound of his own voice startled him, gentle, protective, words he hadn't spoken since before loss had carved him hollow. He rubbed the child's back, steadying the small body with his warmth. Outside, the wind shifted, and with it came the distant howl of wolves. Jed's head snapped up. He reached for the rifle leaning against the hearth. His ears strained. The baby whimpered, and he soothed it with a low hum, a tune his wife used to sing. The melody cracked, half forgotten, but it did the work of calming them both. Dawn was still hours away. His eyes burned with fatigue, but he refused to surrender to sleep. "Not tonight," he muttered, staring into the flames. "If you make it through this night, little one, then I'll see to you proper, that's a promise." He did not know why he said it aloud. Maybe he wanted the mountains to hear. Maybe he wanted to bind himself to something greater than his solitude. The child stirred again, hands twitching like leaves in wind, and let out a sigh that was almost peaceful. Jed brushed a thumb across the tiny forehead, marveling at the weight of life contained in something so small. Time slowed. He lost track of the storm outside, lost track of the hours. There was only the fire, the child, and his heartbeat pounding as if fighting for both of them. At last, faint light touched the cracks between the logs of the cabin wall. Jed blinked against it, weary but unbroken. The baby still breathed, fragile yet steady. Relief flooded him in a way he had not felt in years, a warmth deeper than fire. Jed let out a long breath. "You made it." But as he looked down at the child resting against his chest, he realized something had shifted. He had not just kept the baby alive, the baby had kept him alive too, through the longest night he'd known in years. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the mountain trail glistening under a pale sun. Jed hitched the child close to his chest, wrapped snug in buffalo hide, and started the long trek into town. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the air sharp and biting, but he kept a steady pace. Each step carried not only his own weight, but the fragile burden nestled against him. He told himself it was necessity, nothing more. The baby needed food and supplies he didn't have. Still, something deeper pushed him forward, though he refused to name it. By the time he reached the edge of town, the sun hung high, shining off roofs laden with snow. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of hammers and wagon wheels echoed through the streets. Leadville was no more than a mining settlement dressed as a town, its wooden buildings huddled together against the vastness of the frontier. Men caked in dust and sweat tramped from the shafts. Gamblers leaned on saloon doors, and women in shawls hurried between the mercantile and church. Jed, with his long coat and mountain-worn face, drew eyes the way a wolf did when it strayed too close. At first no one noticed the bundle at his chest. Then a woman fetching water gasped. "Lord above, is that a baby?" Her words carried, and soon a cluster gathered, murmuring. Jed shifted his weight, scowling. "Ain't your concern," he said, his voice flat. But the murmurs grew anyway. "Whose child is it?" "Looks half frozen." "Where'd he get it?" "Don't look like no father to me." Jed's jaw tightened. He hadn't wanted to draw attention, but the frontier thrived on gossip like a saloon thrives on whiskey. From the edge of the crowd stepped a woman with silver-threaded hair pulled into a bun, her face lined not with cruelty, but with years of work and sorrow. Martha Higgins, the widow who ran the boarding house, pushed past the gawkers. She looked straight at Jed, then down at the bundle. "Let me see." Jed hesitated, then loosened the hide just enough. Grace's small face peeked out, cheeks flushed faintly with returning warmth. Martha's eyes softened. "Poor thing," she whispered. "She's barely clinging." Then, sharper, to Jed. "She needs more than goat's milk, and you need more than stubbornness if she's to live." Jed bristled. "She's made it this far." Martha didn't flinch. "Aye, because you kept her warm, but a baby's not a winter's catch you can hang to dry. She needs care, Jedediah Carter, more than a lone man knows." The sheriff arrived, drawn by the crowd. Sheriff McGraw, tall and broad with a weathered mustache, eyed the scene. "Carter, what's this I hear about you hauling a baby out the mountains?" Jed met his gaze evenly. "Found her on the trail." "Wrapped in rags, left to freeze." McGraw's brow furrowed. He studied the child, then the crowd. "Abandoned like that ain't right. Could be somebody comes claiming her. Could be a matter for the church." A murmur of agreement rippled. Jed felt the weight of their stares pressing him into a corner. Martha crossed her arms. "Church'll do what it always does. Feed her a spell, then pass her along. This one's seen enough of cold hands. What she needs is someone who'll fight for her." Jed's voice came rough. "Don't know as I'm the fighting kind no more." But Grace stirred then, letting out a soft cry that silenced the whispers around them. Instinctively Jed rocked her, his large hand steadying her small back. The sound pierced something in the crowd, turning suspicion into uneasy quiet. McGraw cleared his throat. "Well, Carter, whether you keep her or not, you best be ready. A child left like that don't happen without a story behind it. And stories like that have a way of finding their way back." Jed said nothing. He only adjusted the bundle, pulling Grace close again. The crowd slowly broke apart, whispers trailing like smoke. Jed felt eyes on his back as he headed toward the mercantile, Martha walking beside him. For the first time in years he was not invisible, and though he tried to push it aside, the thought pressed harder. Whoever had left Grace out there might not be done with her yet. The mercantile smelled of leather, flour, and tobacco, the kind of place where miners bought supplies and ranchers traded news. Jed pushed the door open with his shoulder, the bell above jangling. A few heads turned, curiosity plain, but no one spoke. He moved down the aisle, the baby pressed tight against him, his boots thudding heavy on the wooden floor. Behind the counter stood Mr. Abernathy, a balding man with wire spectacles perched low on his nose. He looked up, paused, then blinked hard. "Well, I'll be... Carter, is that a baby?" Jed grunted. "Need milk, cloth, something for keeping warm?" Abernathy peered over the counter, his expression caught between disbelief and caution. "That child yours?" Jed's jaw clenched. "She's breathing on account of me. That's all that matters." A woman folding calico near the back snorted. "Don't seem natural him carrying a babe." The remark wasn't cruel, just blunt. In the Old West, people said what they thought. Jed ignored it. He laid coins on the counter, hard enough to clink. "Milk, cloth, now." Abernathy gathered the supplies, setting them down carefully. "Reckon you'll be needin' a name, too." "Can't keep calling her the baby. Folks won't let that be." Jed stared down at the child. Her eyes fluttered open, a pale blue that caught the lamplight. Something stirred in him, something he hadn't felt since his daughter. The name came unbidden, carried on memory and ache. "Grace." Abernathy raised his brows. "Grace Carter, huh? Got a ring to it." Jed didn't argue. Saying the name out loud felt like planting something in frozen ground. Fragile, maybe foolish, but alive. As Jed bundled the goods, the door swung open and Sheriff McGraw stepped inside, hat dusted with snow. His gaze fell straight to the child, then to Jed. "Carter, we need words." Jed stiffened. "Ain't in the mood." McGraw set his hands on his belt. "Doesn't matter. That child's not a stray pup you can keep without question. Somebody might come claiming her and the law's clear. Orphans go to the church first. That way things are done proper." Jed's grip on the bundle tightened. "Proper don't always mean right." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You walk out with her, you're taking on more than you realize. Responsibility, eyes on you. And if her kin show up..." He let the words hang. Jed's thoughts churned. The sheriff wasn't wrong. He had no business raising a child, not with the life he lived. The church would feed her, clothe her, maybe even find her a family. It would be the sensible thing, the safe thing. He looked down again. Grace shifted against his chest, her tiny hand curling into his coat. The warmth of her touch spread like fire through his ribs. For the first time in years, something asked him to stay, to fight, to choose more than survival. Martha Higgins appeared in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She had followed him from the street. "Sheriff, you know as well as I do, the church is stretched thin. They'd pass her along before she could learn to walk." "But this man," she gestured toward Jed, "he carried her out of the mountains when the rest of us would have left her for dead. That counts for something." McGraw rubbed his mustache, considering. "Counts for a lot, but doesn't change the law." Jed's voice came low, steady. "Then the law can chase me if it wants." He turned, pushing past the sheriff, bundled tight in his arms, supplies under his arm. The townsfolk outside parted, watching in silence as Jed walked through the snow. Some eyes were doubtful, others pitying, a few quietly respectful. He did not look back. He reached the edge of town and paused only long enough to adjust the blanket around Grace's face. Her eyes blinked open once more, meeting his. For a heartbeat, the mountains, the loneliness, the weight of loss, all of it seemed lighter. Jed tightened his grip and muttered, "You're mine now, Grace, whatever comes." And with that, he left the town behind, the snow crunching under his boots, the choice made. The trail back to the cabin was slower, weighed down not just by supplies but by the choice Jed had made. Snow had begun to melt under the noon sun, turning the ground slick. Grace slept most of the way, her breath shallow but steady, her warmth pressed against his chest like a stubborn flame refusing to die. Each step carried a question he tried not to ask himself. Had he just bound his life to hers? By the time they reached the hollow, the shadows of the pines were stretching long. Jed pushed the cabin door open and set the bundle down carefully, almost reverently, before unloading the cloth and milk. The place suddenly felt smaller, as though the walls knew there was more life inside than before. He eyed the rough interior with new eyes, bare shelves, piles of pelts, tools scattered. It was no home for a child. "Reckon you'll be needin' a bed," he muttered, scratching his beard. He stepped back outside, axe in hand, and went to the stand of pine near the stream. The sound of each strike echoed through the valley, a rhythm of purpose. By nightfall, he had shaped the beginnings of a cradle, crude but sturdy. His hands, used to traps and rifles, found a different kind of work, smoothing edges, fitting joints, carving space for a life that wasn't his own. Inside, Grace fussed. Jed dropped the tools and hurried, awkward in his urgency. He lifted her gently, bouncing her against his chest. "Hush now, little one, I'm here." The words startled him. They felt foreign yet right, like boots that fit after years of walking barefoot. He fed her again with the rag dipped in milk, her tiny lips clinging as though survival itself depended on that cloth. Watching her, he muttered, "You fight harder than most grown men I've known." Days passed in this rhythm. Jed rose before dawn, stoked the fire, checked his traps, chopped wood, all with Grace either tied against him or bundled where he could keep sight of her. The mountain, unforgiving as always, forced him to adapt. Coyotes circled closer, drawn by the smell of food. A blizzard rolled through, sealing the door in snow and testing the warmth of the fire. He worked twice as hard, not for himself but for her. Nights were hardest. Grace cried often, her voice small but piercing in the stillness. Jed paced the cabin floor, rocking her in strong arms, whispering stories he barely remembered from his own childhood. "Once upon a time," he began one night, then stopped, frowning. He didn't know how to tell such tales anymore, so instead, he spoke plain. "Once upon a time there was a man who lost everything, and then a little girl came and gave him a reason to keep breathing." His throat tightened. He looked down at Grace, who had fallen asleep, her face peaceful against his chest. He whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe that story ain't finished yet." The days bled into weeks. The cradle was finished, rough-hewn but strong. Jed lined it with rabbit fur and laid her down, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. Pride swelled in him, unexpected and stubborn. He had built traps, cabins, even canoes in his years, but nothing had ever felt so necessary as this. Still, Doubts gnawed at him in quiet moments. What if the sheriff came knocking? What if Grace's bloodkin showed to claim her? What if he failed again, like before? The mountain was a cruel teacher, reminding him each day that survival demanded more than strength. It demanded endurance and the will to keep standing when all else wanted to fall. One evening, as the wind rattled the shutters, Jed sat by the fire with Grace nestled in his arm. He looked into the flames and spoke softly. "Didn't reckon on this, Grace. Didn't reckon I'd feel something again." "But you're changing things." The baby stirred, gave a small sigh, and settled again. Jed leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the weight of her presence steady him. The mountain hadn't given him a choice, it had given him a charge. And though he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, he knew this. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking it alone. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as though unwilling to surrender. The snowmelt turned streams into roaring veins that carved the valley, and the trails that had once been treacherous with ice now sank under mud. Jed made more frequent trips into town, Grace tucked close to his chest, her head bobbing gently as he walked. She was stronger now, her cries louder, her grip firmer when she caught hold of his finger. He had grown used to the curious looks, though they hadn't faded. Some folk greeted him with nods, others with whispers that trailed after him like shadows. On one of those trips, he stopped at the trading post to barter pelts for salt and flour. A group of miners sat near the stove, their voices low but urgent. Jed wouldn't have paid them mind, but a word pricked his ear. "Woman." He glanced over, his instincts sharpened by months of keeping Grace alive. One of the miners, a lanky fellow with soot-stained hands, leaned forward. "I'm telling you, she was last seen up near the ridge, riding with those no-goods. Don't sit right." "Nobody's seen her since." Another spat into the stove, the hiss loud. "Outlaws don't keep company with decent women unless it's forced. Likely she's gone for good. And if they left a trail behind..." His eyes flicked toward Jed without meaning to. Jed stiffened, shifting Grace closer. He turned back to the counter, but the words dug into him like burrs. A woman gone missing. Outlaws near the ridge. The same ridge where he'd found Grace wrapped in rags. His mind traced the lines, unwilling but unable to stop. Martha Higgins entered just then, carrying a basket of sewing work. She greeted the miners curtly before coming to Jed. Her eyes, warm but sharp, flicked to the child. "She's growing," Martha said, voice softer now. "Looks stronger than the last time I saw her." Jed nodded, his tone gruff. "She's fighting to stay." Martha studied him for a moment, then glanced toward the miners. "You heard their talk, didn't you?" Jed didn't answer right away. He adjusted the strap of his satchel and finally muttered, "Heard enough." Martha lowered her voice. "Rumors have been running through this town like wildfire. A woman missing, likely dead. Some say she was carrying a child. Some say the men she was with had reason to get rid of both." Her eyes hardened. "Jed, what if Grace is tied to that story?" The room seemed colder despite the stove. Jed's grip on the bundle tightened until Grace stirred, letting out a small whimper. He soothed her instinctively, rocking her against his chest. "Then it means trouble," he said, voice flat. Martha touched his arm, steady and firm. "It also means she's precious, more than you realize. If those men left her, they might come looking, and if they do, you need to be ready." Jed's gaze met hers, a storm in his eyes. "Ready for what? To fight? To lose her like I lost everything else?" Martha didn't flinch, ready to protect her. "You've already chosen her, Jed, whether you admit it or not." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the scrape of boots and the miners' low talk. Jed looked down at Grace, her tiny hand gripping his coat. He thought of the night on the mountain, the whisper of Papa, the long hours by the fire. He had promised himself if she survived, he would see to her. And now, with whispers swirling like vultures overhead, he knew promises had teeth. He gathered his goods and turned toward the door. Martha's voice followed him, steady and warning. "Keep your eyes open. Shadows don't stay hidden forever." Outside, the sky was the color of steel, heavy with spring rain. Jed pulled his coat tighter, Grace secure against him. He felt the weight of her warmth, the fragile trust she carried, and the growing sense that the storm he had weathered on the mountain was nothing compared to what lay ahead. For the first time since he'd taken her in, he wondered if keeping her alive was only the beginning, and if survival would demand more than even the mountains had taught him. The spring rains had settled into a steady rhythm, washing the streets of Leadville into muddy channels. Jed tied his mule outside the boarding house, Grace snug in the crook of his arm. He had come for supplies again, but Martha Higgins intercepted him before he reached the mercantile. She stood under the porch roof, shawl pulled tight, watching him with an expression that was neither unkind nor soft. "You look tired, Jedediah," she said as he climbed the steps. "A man can hunt and trap, but a baby's a different kind of work." Jed shifted Grace, avoiding her eyes. "I'm doing what needs doing." Martha held out her arms. "Let me." For a moment, Jed hesitated. He wasn't used to handing Grace to anyone, not even for a breath, but something in Martha's steady gaze made him relent. He placed the child carefully into her arms. Grace blinked up at the widow, then reached a small hand toward her shawl. Martha smiled faintly. She knows a gentle soul when she sees one. Jed crossed his arms, trying to hide the unease twisting in his gut. "She don't need coddling, she needs strength." "She needs both," Martha replied, rocking the baby with practiced ease. "Strength to survive and softness to grow. You think I don't know what it is to raise children in a hard land? I buried 2 before they were old enough to work the fields." Her voice wavered but steadied again. "Don't tell me what she doesn't need." Jed looked away, throat tight. "I didn't ask for advice." "No," Martha said firmly, "but you're going to get it. Rumors are spreading, Jed, about the missing woman, about the outlaws, about this child. People are wondering if she's tied to trouble, and trouble doesn't pass a town quietly." Jed's jaw tightened. "Let 'em talk." "They will, and some will do more than talk." Martha lowered her voice, leaning closer. "If those men come looking, they won't care you saved her life. They'll see her as something they lost, something they mean to reclaim, or erase." The words dug deep. Jed stared at Grace in Martha's arms, her tiny fingers clutching fabric, innocent of all that might come. His chest tightened. "Then they'll have to go through me." Martha studied him a long moment. "You've lived alone too long, Jed. You're strong, yes, but even strong men break when the weight's too heavy. You don't have to fight this alone." Her tone was not pity, but something else, an invitation, a hand extended. Jed felt it and didn't know what to do with it. He cleared his throat, reaching for Grace. Martha handed her back gently, her eyes never leaving his. "You're not just keeping her alive anymore," Martha said. "How you're raising her whether you meant to or not. That means you have to think beyond tomorrow's firewood or tonight's meal. You have to think what kind of world she's going to wake up in, and who's going to stand beside her." Jed adjusted the blanket around Grace, his voice rough. "I ain't much good at thinking that far." "Then learn," Martha answered simply. For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain pattered on the roof, steady as a drumbeat. Grace yawned, her face pressing into Jed's chest, small and trusting. Martha's voice softened. "She's given you a chance, Jed. Not many men get one after all you've been through. Don't waste it by thinking you can do everything with your back turned to the world." Jed met her gaze, a storm still in his eyes but less certain than before. "I don't trust easy." "Good," Martha said. "Then you'll know who's worth trusting when the time comes." He stepped down from the porch, water splashing under his boots. Grace stirred, but settled quickly, the warmth of her small body grounding him. He glanced back once, meeting Martha's steady eyes. He didn't speak, but the weight of her words followed him into the rain. The mountain had taught him survival. Now the widow's counsel had planted something different, an idea he couldn't yet name but couldn't ignore. The sun hung low over Leadville, casting long shadows across the muddy street. Jed had just finished bartering pelts for coffee and powder when the sound of hooves broke the quiet rhythm of the town. 4 riders came in from the west, dust rising behind them, their horses lean and restless. They weren't miners or cowhands. Their faces were hard, their coats patched with road wear, their eyes scanning like men used to sizing up weakness. The saloon doors swung wide as the men dismounted, spurs clinking. One spat tobacco into the mud, his gaze sweeping the street. "'Tain't no law worth the name in this place," he drawled, voice sharp enough to cut. Jed froze where he stood, Grace pressed close to his chest under the folds of his coat. His instincts prickled. These weren't just drifters. They moved with the sharpness of wolves who knew exactly what they were hunting. Sheriff McGraw stepped out of his office, hand resting on his belt. "Afternoon, boys." "What brings you riding in?" The leader, a tall man with a scar running from temple to jaw, tipped his hat without warmth. "Lost something on the trail a while back. Something small, but mighty valuable. We aim to find it." His eyes scanned the street again, lingering a moment too long on Jed before sliding away. Jed shifted, heart pounding. He pulled his hat low and started toward the mercantile, keeping his face turned. Grace stirred, letting out a small whimper muffled by the coat. He tightened his grip, muttering low, "Hush now, girl." The outlaw nearest the trough cocked his head. "Hear that?" Jed kept walking, every step heavy. Martha Higgins appeared on the porch of her boarding house, her sharp eyes darting between Jed and the strangers. She seemed to sense it too, the danger coiling tight in the air. Inside the saloon, voices rose as the men pushed through, ordering whiskey with the kind of authority that came from carrying iron and daring anyone to object. Whispers spread among the townsfolk. Jed caught snatches as he passed a group near the blacksmiths. "They're asking about a woman went missing. Said she had a babe with her. Reckon Carter knows something?" Jed gritted his teeth. Every word felt like a noose tightening. He hurried toward his mule, the weight of Grace heavier than ever. He could feel the eyes on his back. Not just the outlaws, not just the curious townsfolk, but the eyes of suspicion, of fear. Sheriff McGraw caught up to him before he reached the hitching post. "Carter," he said low, "don't stir trouble. They're sniffing around. I don't need you giving them a reason." Jed's voice came out harsh. "They're here for her." The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "Maybe. But if you flare up, this town will be blood on the snow. Keep your head down, Jed." Jed looked him dead in the eye. "Ain't no keeping down when wolves got the scent." Grace whimpered again, and McGraw's gaze flicked to the coat where she hid. His face darkened. "Then you best be smart. They ain't gonna stop asking, and you can't hide her forever." Jed swung into the saddle, the mule stamping as though it sensed his unease. Martha called out softly from her porch, "Jedediah, be careful." He didn't answer, only tugged the reins and rode hard out of town, the wind cutting his face, his gut knotted. Behind him, laughter rolled out of the saloon, hard, cruel, hungry. The kind of laughter that meant danger had only just arrived. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and waiting. Jed urged the mule faster, Grace's warmth pressed against him. His mind raced with Martha's warning and the sheriff's grim truth. He knew one thing with certainty. His cabin was no longer a refuge. The shadows from the past had caught up to them, and this time they carried guns. Jed pushed the mule hard up the trail, the hooves slipping on loose stone. The weight of Grace clutched tight against his chest. The town fell away behind him, swallowed by the valley. The air grew thinner, colder, and the smell of pine thickened as he climbed. His heart hammered as though he were the one being hunted by wolves, every sound in the timber stirring suspicion. Grace stirred, letting out a small cry muffled against his coat. Jed bent his head low. "Easy now, girl. Hush." His voice was softer than he intended, cracked with the strain of fear. He rocked her gently, even as the mule stumbled upward. He had carried pelts, rifles, traps, even wounded men across these mountains, but never had the burden felt so precious, so breakable. Behind him, the thought of the outlaws gnawed. They were not men who left things unfinished. If they believed Grace was theirs to claim, or theirs to silence, they would track him until the mountains froze them or swallowed them whole. Jed knew the land better than any of them, but the weight of a baby in winter turned every strength into a weakness. The trail cut across a swollen creek, the water roaring with melt. Jed dismounted, boots sinking in mud, and carried Grace across with careful steps. The icy spray bit his skin, but he shielded her, whispering, Ain't nothing gonna touch you. Not while I draw breath. On the far side, he set her in the crook of his arm and tugged the mule forward. His breath came hard, steam rising in clouds. He pushed deeper into the timber, where the pines grew thick and the ground rose steep. The shadows lengthened, and with them, his unease. Hours passed. The baby fussed again, hungry. Jed stopped beneath a rocky ledge, tying the mule to a low branch. He crouched by a small fire he coaxed to life, warming milk in a tin cup. Grace latched weakly to the rag, sucking until her eyes fluttered closed again. Watching her, Jed felt both relief and a twisting ache deep inside. He spoke low, words spilling as if the silence demanded them. "I don't know what I'm doing, Grace. Truth is, I ain't fit for this, but when you said Papa that night, it stuck. I can't shake it." His hand trembled as he stroked her cheek. "I lost once. I ain't losing again." A distant crack echoed through the timber. Hoofbeats faint but steady. Jed froze, his rifle already in hand. He stamped the fire out quick, scattering embers into the mud, then slung his pack. With Grace bundled tight, he led the mule higher into the rocks, forcing a climb that no outlaw would take easy. The mountain tested them. Loose shale slid under his boots. The mule balked at narrow passes, and more than once Jed nearly lost his footing. But every time, Grace's small weight anchored him. Her breath against his chest was enough to drive him forward when his legs threatened to fail. At last they reached a high ridge where the wind whipped fierce and cold. Jed crouched behind a boulder, chest heaving. He scanned the valley below. Through the trees, faint figures moved on horseback, dark shapes cutting across the trail he had left. The outlaws were coming. Jed pressed his lips to Grace's forehead. "We'll keep ahead of 'em. I swear it." She stirred, eyes fluttering open just long enough to look at him. Her lips parted, a sound escaping, soft, broken, but clear enough to strike him deep. "Papa." The word settled in his bones, steadying his breath, sharpening his will. Jed's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening against the wind. He wasn't just running anymore. He was fighting for what was his. He rose, adjusted the rifle on his shoulder, and began the climb into the deeper wild. The outlaws were behind him, the storm of the mountains ahead. Between them, one man and a child, bound by a word that had already changed everything. Jed reached his cabin by dusk, the sky painted with streaks of fire fading into bruised purple. He pushed the door open, his breath ragged from the climb. Grace was quiet now, worn out from the rough trail, her head tucked against his chest. The mule stood restless outside, ears twitching toward the valley. Jed knew what that meant. Danger was still on their heels. Inside, he laid Grace in the cradle he had built weeks before. She stirred, whimpered once, then settled. Jed stood over her, watching, his face carved with determination. "You stay quiet, little one. Let me do the fighting." He moved quickly, hands steady though his heart pounded. He checked his traps hidden around the cabin, snares strung on low trails, sharpened stakes angled just right. He had hunted men before during darker years, and the knowledge came back to him like muscle memory. The mountains had taught him more than how to survive. They had taught him how to make the land itself a weapon. The first sound came after nightfall, the distant crack of branches, deliberate steps in the timber. Jed's fingers tightened on his rifle. He crouched by the shutter, eyes scanning the tree line. A shadow moved, then another. They were here. A voice called out sharp against the still night. "Carter, we know you got something that belongs to us. Hand it over and maybe we'll leave you breathing." Jed's jaw clenched. He leaned out just enough to answer, voice like gravel. "She don't belong to you. She belongs to no one but herself." Laughter cut back through the dark, cruel and mocking. "That ain't how this works, mountain man. That babe ain't nothing but a burden. Best hand her over before we burn you out." Jed fired once, the crack of his rifle splitting the night. A curse followed from the trees, the outlaws diving for cover. Silence settled again, heavy and tense. Grace whimpered in the cradle, her tiny voice carrying too far. Jed rushed to her side, lifting her gently, whispering against her hair. "Hush now, darling. Don't you give us away." His chest ached hearing her fear, but his arms held steady. He pressed her close, rocking until she stilled, then laid her back with care. The outlaws tried again, creeping closer, their boots crunching on snow. Jed lit a lantern and tossed it out the back window. It shattered against the rocks, flames leaping bright. A gunshot followed, the outlaws firing at shadows. Jed slipped out the side door, silent as a fox, circling wide until he had a clear angle. He fired again, dropping one of their rifles from nervous hands, but they were many, and he was one. The cabin became a fortress under siege, bullets punching splinters from the logs, curses ringing in the dark. Jed fired back with precision, never wasting a shot, but he knew this game couldn't last forever. Between volleys, he caught his breath and glanced at Grace, her small body trembling under the furs. His heart twisted. "I ain't letting 'em take you," he muttered, "not while I got breath in me." Hours dragged, the fight stretching thin. The firelight outside died down, leaving only the hiss of wind through the trees. Then came another voice, different from the first, lower, colder. "So you can't hold out forever, Carter. We'll wait till you're too tired to shoot, then we'll take what's ours." Jed wiped the sweat from his brow, though the air was freezing. His body ached, but his will was iron. He crouched by the cradle once more, brushing Grace's forehead with a calloused hand. "You hear that? They think they'll break me. But they don't know I already been broken long before you came. And what's left of me, it's yours now." The baby shifted, a tiny sigh escaping. Jed's resolve hardened. He rose again, rifle in hand, eyes sharp as flint. The siege wasn't over, but neither was his fight. The night stretched on like a wound that would not close. Smoke clung to the rafters of the cabin, acrid and heavy, and every corner of Jed's body ached from holding steady. The outlaws prowled outside, their taunts fading into silence as fatigue and caution took hold. Still, Jed knew they weren't leaving. Wolves never quit once they'd scented blood. Grace whimpered, her small voice cutting through the dark. Jed pressed his lips to her forehead, whispering, "Hush now, you're safe. Long as I breathe, you're safe." But even as he spoke, doubt clawed at him. His ammunition was running low. His strength, too. He could fight, but he couldn't fight forever. Then, just as the stillness threatened to crush him, a sound rose from the distance. Hoofbeats, many of them, steady and sure. Jed's heart jumped. For a fleeting second, fear struck him that more outlaws had joined the hunt. But the rhythm was different, purposeful. Then came a shout, echoing through the timber. "Sheriff McGraw! Lay down your arms, you vermin, or face the rope!" Gunfire cracked as the outlaws answered with curses, their voices splintering into panic. Jed ducked low, cradling Grace, hope and disbelief warring inside him. Through the shutter, he caught sight of lanterns weaving through the trees, and figures on horseback riding hard into the clearing. Martha Higgins was among them, shawl whipping in the wind as she rode beside the sheriff's posse. Her voice carried strong, sharper than Jed had ever heard it. "Hold fast, Jedediah. You're not alone tonight." The words hit him deeper than any bullet could. Not alone. For years he had lived convinced that was the only way a man survived. Alone, hardened, silent. But now, hearing her voice, seeing the sheriff and half a dozen townsfolk riding to his aid, something inside him shifted. The cabin shook as bullets whined past, outlaws firing desperate shots at the incoming riders. Jed steadied his rifle, aimed, and returned fire with renewed purpose. The crack split the air, and one outlaw stumbled in the snow, cursing as his gun fell from his hands. The sheriff's men answered with a volley, their rifles lighting the dark. The outlaws, outnumbered now, scattered for cover, firing wildly. Jed could hear McGraw shouting commands, his voice steady as iron. "Cut 'em off from the ridge." "Don't let 'em slip away." Martha dismounted, running through the snow toward the cabin. Jed swung the door open, pulling her inside just as bullets thudded against the logs. She panted, her cheeks red with cold and exertion, but her eyes blazed with fire. "I told you, Jed, you don't have to carry this alone." Jed looked at her, chest heaving, Grace crying softly in his arms. For a moment words failed him. Finally he said hoarsely, "Didn't reckon anyone would come." Martha set a hand on his arm, steadying him. Then reckon again. Outside, the fight raged. The sheriff's men pressed the outlaws hard, the crack of rifles rolling across the timber. Jed joined the defense, firing from the doorway, every shot measured. The tide was turning. The leader of the outlaws shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. "Fall back, we'll take 'em another day." And then they were gone, retreating into the trees, their hoofbeats fading into the night. Silence settled over the hollow, broken only by the ragged breaths of men and the cry of a baby who had weathered the storm. Jed lowered his rifle, the weight of it suddenly heavier than ever. He looked at Grace, then at Martha, then at the sheriff striding up through the snow. McGraw's eyes were sharp, but not without respect. "You put up one hell of a fight, Carter, but this ain't over. They'll be back." Jed nodded, his voice low. "Then I'll be ready." But in his heart, something else stirred, a realization that the fight wasn't his alone anymore. For the first time in years, others had stood with him, and that changed everything. The cabin was quiet again, though the silence felt fragile, as if one wrong breath could shatter it. Snowflakes drifted through the pines outside, covering the blood and footprints left by the fight. Inside, Jed sat by the fire, Grace nestled against his chest, her tiny hands clutching the edge of his shirt. He had fought for her, bled for her, and yet unease gnawed at him. The outlaws hadn't come by chance, they had come with purpose. Sheriff McGraw leaned against the doorframe, his hat in his hand, eyes heavy. Martha sat nearby, her sewing basket untouched in her lap, gaze fixed on the baby. Jed broke the silence first. "You best speak plain, Sheriff." "You know something I don't." McGraw sighed, running a hand down his mustache. "We got one of the bastards alive, shot in the leg, couldn't ride off with the others. My men hauled him back to town, and he's been talking more than he ought to. Name's Rafe. Mean as a rattler, but pain'll loosen a man's tongue." Jed's grip on Grace tightened. "What did he say?" The sheriff's eyes flicked to the child, then back. "That baby ain't just some lost soul. Her mother was a woman they took against her will weeks back. She fought 'em every mile, and when she gave birth, she tried to run. They silenced her for it." His voice lowered. "They meant to silence the babe, too. But whether out of cowardice or haste, they left her on that trail, figuring the cold would do the work." Jed's throat went dry. He looked down at Grace, her breathing soft against him, her face innocent of the cruelty that had brought her into his arms. "And her mother?" McGraw shook his head. "Dead. Buried shallow somewhere in the hills, no marker but the coyotes." Martha's hand flew to her mouth, eyes glistening. "Lord have mercy." She looked at Jed, voice trembling but fierce. "That child carries her mother's fight in her veins. Don't you see? She was meant to live, no matter the cost." Jed swallowed hard, memories of his own loss pressing heavy. He spoke low, almost to himself. "They took her mother, and now they want to finish what they started. That's why they came." McGraw nodded grimly. "Rafe said she's the last piece of proof left against him. If she survives, their crime don't stay buried. That's why they'll keep coming till she's gone." The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney. Jed stared into it, his face carved from stone. The thought of losing Grace after everything tightened around his chest like a vice. He whispered, "Over my dead body." Martha leaned forward, her voice steady. "Jedediah, listen to me. You found her because you were meant to. You've carried her because you were strong enough to. But now you must see this isn't just about you, it's about justice. It's about her having a chance to grow without fear." Jed lifted his eyes to hers, stormy but clear. "You think I don't know that? Every time I hear her cry, every time she looks at me with them eyes, I feel it. She ain't just mine. She's a promise I can't break." The sheriff straightened, slipping his hat back on. "Then you best be ready, Carter. I'll do my part, but the law out here don't stretch far. If they ride again, and they will, it won't be for ransom or claim. It'll be for blood." Jed rose slowly, Grace still in his arms, her tiny heartbeat steady against his chest. He spoke with the weight of a man who had already made his choice. "Let 'em come, I'll stand. And if the whole damn mountain falls on me, I'll stand still." Martha's eyes softened, tears shining. She whispered, "Then maybe Grace has already given you more than you know." Jed glanced down at the child, her lips parting in sleep, and felt the truth of it settle deep inside. He wasn't just fighting for her life, he was fighting for redemption, for justice, for something larger than himself. And he knew, without doubt, that there was no turning back. The town of Leadville had never seen a crowd so restless. Word had spread fast. The captured outlaw, Rafe, would stand before Judge Wilkins, and Jedediah Carter would testify. Men left the mines early. Women gathered with shawls pulled tight against the wind, and children peeked around corners, sensing the weight of something bigger than their daily grind. Inside the courthouse, a rough wooden hall more used to land disputes than murder trials, the air was thick with smoke and whispers. Sheriff McGraw stood by the door, hand near his revolver, eyes scanning every face. Martha sat close to the front, Grace in her lap, wrapped in a blanket. The baby slept, oblivious to the storm circling her small life. Jed stood near the witness chair, his frame filling the space. He looked more like a man carved from the mountains than one meant for public speaking. Still, when the judge called his name, he stepped forward with a steadiness that silenced the room. "Mr. Carter," Judge Wilkins began, his spectacles low on his nose, "tell this court how you came upon the child." Jed's voice was rough but steady. "Found her on the mountain trail, winter's worst night. She was wrapped in rags, left for dead. I carried her to my cabin, kept her warm, fed her as best I could. If I hadn't—" He paused, his throat tightening. "She wouldn't be sitting here today." The room shifted with murmurs. Jed kept his eyes on the judge, though he felt the weight of every gaze pressing down. The prosecutor, a lean man with a sharp voice, stepped forward. "And you believe these men?" He gestured toward Rafe, shackled and sullen at the defendant's table. "Are the ones who abandoned her?" Jed's jaw tightened. "I don't just believe it. I know it. Sheriff's men heard it from his own mouth. That baby's mama fought him, tried to escape after she gave birth. They killed her for it. Then they tossed the child aside like kindling." His voice hardened. "They thought the mountain would finish their work." Gasps rippled through the hall. Martha held Grace tighter, tears shining in her eyes. Rafe sneered, spitting to the floor. "That woman weren't nothing but trouble. Babe was dead weight. Carter here's just a fool who don't know when to quit." Jed's eyes burned into him. "She weren't dead weight. She's a life, and I'll see to it the world knows it." The judge slammed his gavel, the sound cracking like thunder. "Enough." Sheriff McGraw stepped forward, addressing the room. "You all heard it. These men thought they could do as they pleased in the dark, that the mountains would hide their sins. But the mountains gave that babe a protector, and now their crimes are laid bare." The trial pressed on, with more testimony. Miners who'd seen the woman last, townsfolk who'd heard the outlaws boasting drunk in saloons. Piece by piece the picture sharpened. A mother stolen, a child abandoned, and men who thought themselves untouchable. When the judge finally gave his verdict, the hall held its breath. "By the law of this territory," he declared, voice stern, "you are guilty of murder, abduction, and abandonment. You will hang for your crimes." A cheer rose, mixed with shouts and sobs. Martha wept openly, pressing Grace's small hand to her cheek. The sheriff's men hauled Rafe away, his curses trailing uselessly. Jed stood still, the weight of it all pressing on him. Justice had been named, but justice did not bring back the woman who had fought to the end. He looked down at Grace, her tiny chest rising and falling, her innocence untouched by the ugliness spoken in that room. His voice was low, steady, meant only for her. "They won't ever take you again, not while I draw breath." Martha rose, coming to his side. She touched his arm gently, her voice soft but firm. "You've done more than fight for her, Jed. You've given her a name, a place, a chance." For a moment Jed allowed himself to breathe. The hall buzzed with voices, the sound of a town shaken but united. He felt the weight of the mountain still on his shoulders, but for the first time it was shared. And in that crowded room, with justice served, Jed realized he was no longer just a man surviving the wilderness. He was a father standing in the open, ready for whatever reckoning lay ahead. The weeks after the trial passed with a calmness that felt strange to Jed, like a silence after thunder. The town carried on, miners returning to shafts, wagons rumbling along the muddy street. But something had shifted. People no longer looked at Jed as the hermit of the mountains. They looked at him as the man who had stood against outlaws, who had carried a child through winter storms, who had given her a name. Grace grew stronger with each passing day. Her cheeks filled out, her laugh, small but bright, bounced off the log walls of the cabin. Jed found himself listening for it, waiting for it, living for it. The cradle he had built was nearly too small for her now, and he caught himself carving a bigger one, muttering, "Reckon you'll be running before long." One morning Martha came up the trail, a basket of bread on her arm. She watched Jed kneel in the dirt outside the cabin, holding Grace steady as her tiny legs wobbled against the ground. "She'll walk before summer's through," Martha said, smiling. Jed grunted, though there was warmth in his eyes. "She's stubborn enough." Martha stepped closer, her voice gentle. "And you? What will you do now that the worst has passed?" Jed looked at Grace, who clung to his thumb with fierce determination. He thought of all the nights he'd sworn never to love again, never to risk the pain of loss. Yet here he was, heart bound tighter than ever. "I'll raise her," he said simply. "Proper. She's mine now." Martha studied him, then nodded, her eyes soft. "Then she's blessed." Later that week, Sheriff McGraw rode up to the cabin with papers in hand. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the earth, and handed them to Jed. "Court signed off. She's yours in the eyes of the law now. Grace Carter." Jed held the papers, rough hands trembling. The name written in ink looked strange and yet truer than anything he had ever read. He whispered it aloud, "Grace Carter," and the baby cooed as if she knew. The sheriff tipped his hat. "You done right by her, Jed. Not many men could have. World's better for it." As McGraw rode off, Jed stood in the doorway, the papers pressed against his chest, Grace nestled in his other arm. For the first time since fever had taken his family, he felt whole. The mountains no longer seemed like walls of stone pressing down on him. They looked like guardians rising tall, sheltering the valley where a new life had begun. He walked the trail with Grace strapped to his back, teaching her the smell of pine, the call of a hawk, the rush of the creek. He spoke to her as if she could understand, telling her of storms weathered and battles fought, of a mother she would never know, and of the promise he'd made on a frozen night. In town, people greeted him differently. Children waved, women offered smiles, and men tipped their hats. They no longer whispered with suspicion but with respect. Martha often visited, her presence steady, her laughter filling the cabin alongside Grace's. A bond was forming, quiet but sure, one that hinted Jed's solitude might not last forever. One evening, as the sun sank gold behind the ridges, Jed sat on the porch, Grace in his lap. She reached toward the sky, her small fingers grasping at the fading light. Jed watched her, a slow smile tugging his lips. "World's yours now, girl, and I'll see you get your chance at it." The wind carried the scent of pine and earth, no longer lonely, but alive. Jed breathed deep, letting it fill him. He had been a man broken by loss, buried by silence. Now he was something else, a father, forged again by fire, storm, and the fragile strength of a child who had whispered one word that changed everything. Grace stirred, murmuring softly. Jed pressed his cheek to her hair and whispered back, "Papa's here." And with that, the story of Jedediah Carter and the child he saved was no longer just survival. It was redemption. If this story of survival, redemption, and unexpected family touched you, subscribe to our channel and click the video on your screen for another powerful tale of the Old West.